So we were talking about this ceremony every 7th year. Deuteronomy chapter 31, it tells them, God commands through Moses for Israel to gather and hear the Torah read, the 5 books of Moses read every 7th year. And it says in verse 11, when all of Israel comes to appear before the presence of Jehovah your God, in the place that he shall choose, you shall read this Torah before all of Israel in their ears. Now, why do they do that? Verse 12 explains, gather the people, the men, the women, and the children, and the sojourner in their gates, in order that they will hear, in order that they will learn, and they will fear Jehovah your God, and they will diligently do all the words of this Torah. So the purpose of hearing the Torah read every 7th year was so that the people would hear it. By hearing it, they would learn it. And by learning it, they would then be able to fear God and do it. So it wasn't some empty ritual. This was something they were commanded to do so that they would know the Torah. Now think about it. The average person back then didn't have a copy of Scripture. He didn't have a Bible in his house. Unless you were the king, you couldn't afford to own a Bible. And so the way they learned it was by hearing it every 7th year. Now when I come to read Scripture, I ask myself, if I were an ancient Israelite 3,500 years ago, standing and hearing the Torah read for the first time, I've never heard this book before, what would it mean? How would I understand it? Because what he's telling us here is that this is how he intends us to learn the Torah, by hearing it read. Now, to understand that, I've got to bridge some gaps. The first gap I have to bridge is of language. I have to understand it in the original language, because when you translate it, you change the meaning. I also have to bridge a cultural gap of 3,500 years. And what's interesting is the next verse, verse 13. It says, and their children who did not know, meaning somebody who's never heard this book read before, they shall hear and learn to fear Jehovah your God all the days which you are living upon the earth, etc. So it's saying even children would hear the Torah read and they would know how to keep it. It's written in such a way that even a child could hear it and understand it. So I try to put myself in the shoes of that child and ask myself, how would I understand it if I was a child? Now, why do I say this? Because I grew up in a tradition where I was taught that you can't understand Scripture by hearing it. You can only understand it if you get a rabbi to explain to you what it really means. And what it really means is not what it says. And I'll give you a very simple example that really illustrates all these points. So it says 3 times in the Torah, word for word, 3 times, verbatim, letter for letter, jot for jot, tittle for tittle, it says, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo. Ellie, do you understand what that means?
Most likely you're supposed to listen to the word, or say the word.
So the words I just said, Lo tevashel gedi b'chalev imo.
Not those words, no.
What does that mean? Well, so you need to know Hebrew to understand it. Okay. So those are Hebrew words that means do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. You've heard that commandment before, right? Mm-hmm. Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. So what does that mean? So in the tradition I grew up with, I was taught that doesn't mean don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. That means don't eat meat and milk together. Any meat and any milk, don't eat them together. It also means don't cook meat and milk together, even if you're not going to eat it. And it means you can't even benefit from meat and milk cooked together. Well, what does benefit mean? It means you can't even feed it to a dog. Poor Captain, where is he? You can't even feed meat and milk cooked together to Captain, to your dog. So, and they say, why was it repeated 3 times? Because to teach each of those 3 messages. And I read this and I say, if it says the same thing 3 times, then it means the same thing. Now, why would you repeat yourself 3 times? Because the rabbis say, oh no, you think you know what it means because you can read Hebrew and you can understand Scripture. But there's this other layer of explanation, the oral law, this oral Torah, that you need in order to really understand it. And I say, when I was growing up, I asked the question, I said, okay, you're telling me Moses went up to Mount Sinai and received 2 revelations, 1 written and 1 oral. Maybe that happened. I wasn't there. I don't know. Where in the written Scripture does it ever mention the second Torah? This is the oral Torah, right? I mean, if I were to write for you a series of instructions and then give it to you, and then somebody else would come along and say, oh no, you're not supposed to follow the written instructions alone. You have to follow the written and the oral, right? I mean, let's say someone were to, die, and leave their last will and testament. And then somebody else comes to the lawyer and says, no, we're not supposed to follow the last will and testament. By itself, we have to also follow the videotaped instructions. Well, where are those videotaped instructions? Are they not? And would you accept that if it wasn't mentioned in the written testimony? Now, today we can have a videotape where you see somebody's face. But when it comes to Scripture, we don't have the videotape of God speaking the oral law. We have rabbis thousands of years later saying, this was revealed to Moses and transmitted to Joshua, and Joshua transmitted it to some other rabbi, and another rabbi transmitted it to some other rabbi, and I have this through broken telephone 2,400 years later. Well, where is that mentioned in this book? In the written Scripture, does it ever mention an oral law? This is what I was asking my rabbis, and they actually were able to bring me a verse that mentions the oral law. Let me read it to you. And you have to understand, Judaism today, if you go to any Jewish synagogue in the world, you're not seeing you're not seeing the faith of the Old Testament, of the Tanakh. You're seeing the faith of the Tanakh as filtered through the oral law. And so this is an important concept. I asked the question when I was growing up, where does it say that in Scripture? And they pointed me to a verse, Exodus chapter 24, verse 12, which is a key verse. It's describing Moses just before he's about to go up to Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. Because that's one of their claims, that Moses went up for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, and he received the written Scripture, but he also received this oral revelation for 40 days and 40 nights. And so it says here, Exodus 24:12, and Jehovah said to Moses, go up to me to the mountain and be there, and I will give you the tablets of stone and the Torah and the commandments which I have written to teach them. So where does it mention an oral law? It doesn't. But they say, oh, you think it doesn't because you don't know the true interpretation of that verse from the oral law. It says, which I have written. Up until there, everyone agrees that was written stuff. The last word in Hebrew, which in English in the King James is that thou mayest teach them. 5 words. That thou mayest teach them. In Hebrew, it's 1 word, lahogotam. That refers to the oral law.
Okay.
Now, when I was told this growing up, I said, if that's your only proof of the oral law, it actually proves the oral law didn't exist. Mm-hmm. That it was something that was made up thousands of years later. Because in the entire Old Testament, in my Hebrew Bible here, the one I bought on Amazon.com, let's see how many pages it has. I don't even remember. It has in the Hebrew text of my Bible 1,643 pages. And in the entire 1,643 pages, it has one Hebrew word that refers to the oral law, and that's the word that's translated in English with 5 words, that thou mayest teach them. That proves the oral law didn't exist when this book was written. Now, when was this book written? This is actually a collection of 24 books. The first 5 books are the Torah. And then you have a bunch of other books, Joshua and Judges. And the last book we have historically, or the last period, is the book of Malachi. He was the last prophet who we can date. And he's sometime in the 4th century BCE, or BC. So between when Moses lived and Malachi is about 1,100 years. So 1,100 years, 1,627 pages, and there's one word that refers to the oral law, and that's the word that thou mayest teach them. No. It must be made up later. That's what I concluded. And this was really an important revelation for me, because it meant I can't take what somebody else says about this book. I've got to read it for myself. You know, when I was very, very young, my father hired a tutor, a rabbi, to teach me. He was a rabbi by ordination, but rabbi doesn't really pay any money. So by profession, he was a lawyer. So he paid someone to teach me. And I sat with this rabbi day after day, and the rabbi would read a verse from Scripture. He would read, I could read you the first verse of the Torah. And that's where we started, in the first verse of Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And I remember he was a New Yorker. And I remember he read to me this verse. It's kind of funny. He said, we read, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. V'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu. And the earth was void and without form, v'choshech al pnei tehom, and darkness over the face of the deep, v'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. And this is how we read it. And the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. And I said to him, the Spirit of God did what over the face of the waters? He was a New Yorker. It hovered. I said, what is hovered? I didn't know that word. He said, like a helicopter. It hovered. To hover. I didn't know what hover was either. I was a little kid. I was too young to know that word. I remember that. Now, when you're a little kid, you kind of got to accept everything they say. You don't know any better. And I remember thinking, because we would read the verse, he would translate it, and then we would read what Rashi said. Rashi was this great 12th century rabbinical commentator who would go word by word, verse by verse, and tell you, you just read this in Scripture, here's what it really means. And he essentially took all of the teachings of the rabbis up until that point and summarized them in a very concise way. And when most Orthodox Jews study Scripture, the way they do it is they read a verse and they read what Rashi says. And so I remember thinking, Rashi is so smart. I read the verse and I had no idea that boiling a kid in its mother's milk had anything to do with eating a cheeseburger. I just didn't see it. And I was told the reason you don't see it is you don't have enough knowledge. When you've studied more and you learned more, and you're fluent in Hebrew and you can read it for yourself in the original language without somebody telling you what it means, and you've read the rabbinical writings and teachings, then you'll know how Rashi came to that conclusion. And they were right. Years later, after I got my master's degree in biblical studies, I opened up Rashi and I said, I know now how he got this. He just made it up. And that's true. He didn't make it up. He was copying it from someone else who made it up. And so I've got to see it for myself in Scripture. You know, I was born and raised in Chicago. I lived half my life in Jerusalem, Israel. But deep in my heart, I'm from Missouri. You know, Missouri is the show me state. And I need you to show me for me to accept something. And you've got to show me in this book. If you can show me in this book, then that's truth. If you've just made something up and you say it's in the book and I read it and I can't see it, well, then I can't accept it. So do not boil a kid in its mother's milk appears 3 times, and the rabbis have an entire constellation of rules and regulations around this statement. Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. You can't eat meat and milk together. You have to have separate dishes. Dishes for meat and dishes for milk. And it's not just milk from a glass. It's any dairy product. If a piece of pizza touches a plate, that plate can never be used for beef. You have to throw it away before using it for beef. Get another plate and use that plate. If you put a piece of cheese pizza and then after a piece of beef, that plate has to be thrown in the garbage. That's what the rabbis teach. And that's all from the verse 3 times, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Now there's an old joke about that that's actually told by Orthodox Jews. And this is really an important example because it's an example of why God would repeat himself. How Scripture was intended to be understood. We just read in Deuteronomy 31 that they heard Scripture read to them every 7 years. Now, why repeat yourself? Because if you're hearing it once every 7 years and you want the people to remember, you better repeat it if it's important. And so think about how many times Scripture speaks about the Sabbath. Quite a few, because the Sabbath was important. It was the sign of the covenant between the God of Israel and the people of Israel. It was important. 3 times, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. I think he repeated himself because it was important for us to know that. The rabbis say, no, if he repeated himself 3 times, it means 3 different things. Because Scripture is a holy code. I may repeat myself because I'm imperfect, but God who's perfect doesn't repeat himself unless he wants to teach you something else. That's what the rabbis say. And how do we know what that secret hidden information is? Well, that you need the oral law for. You've got to ask the rabbis that. That's a pretty convenient system for them. What was I talking about? Oh, do not boil a kid. So the old joke, it's a joke that Orthodox Jews tell. And the joke is that Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and God says to him, Moses, that's how God sounds, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, what could that possibly mean? What a strange thing to say. A kid is a young goat. I know that in Hebrew, gedi. But boiling a young goat in its mother's milk, why would anybody do that? You must mean something else. I know what you mean. You mean don't eat meat and milk together. Moses, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. What do you mean by that? That must mean something else. You mean have separate dishes when I eat milk for versus when I eat meat. Moses, do not boil a kid in its mother's milk. What do you mean by that? That's got to be something else. Oh, I know what you mean. You mean after I eat meat, I've got to wait 6 hours before eating milk, which is what Orthodox Jews actually do.
Oh.
God hears this and he says, do whatever you want. Now that's a joke, but it really illustrates a really profound point. Orthodox Jews tell this joke, and what they mean by it is if God repeats himself, he means different things. But they're aware on some level that what they're saying doesn't sound like what God means. It doesn't sound even remotely like what God says. So I don't take the Bible literally. I think that's how I got into this whole topic. It's not a matter of taking the Bible literally. It's a matter of understanding it based on the language and the context, using common sense.